Make that baby stop crying. Margaret's voice cut through the upstairs hallway just after midnight. I tightened my arms around my 6-week-old daughter, Sophie, and kept rocking her against my chest. She had been crying for almost 40 minutes. I had fed her, changed her diaper, burped her twice. Nothing worked. I'm trying, I whispered. I think her stomach hurts. Margaret stepped closer. I raised 3 children. None of them screamed through my house like this. I turned toward the nursery. Daniel, my husband, was working his overnight maintenance shift at the hospital. I was alone in his mother's house, exhausted and still recovering from childbirth. Please, Margaret, I'll take her into the nursery. She followed me. You don't know what you're doing with that child. I stopped. For 6 weeks, I had swallowed comments like that because Daniel and I couldn't afford our own apartment yet. But that night, I finally turned around. Please don't speak to me like that. She's a newborn. Margaret stared at me. Then she slapped me. Hard. My head snapped sideways. My arms opened instinctively as I stumbled backward. And Sophie slipped from my hands. She hit the carpeted floor beside the nursery doorway. Her crying stopped. Completely. Sophie. I dropped to my knees. Her tiny body was motionless. Sophie. I touched her cheek, waiting for her to move, blink, anything. Behind me, Margaret said coldly, "Shut her up or get out of my house." I stared at her. Something inside me changed. I grabbed my phone and called emergency services. "What are you doing?" Margaret demanded. "My daughter isn't responding." "She's fine, Bobby's fall." "Stay away from her." It was the first time I had ever spoken to Margaret that way. Her face changed immediately. "Vanessa, don't tell them some ridiculous story. You were tired. You dropped her." I looked up slowly. "You hit me." "It was an accident." "No, it was." The dispatcher told me not to move Sophie unnecessarily and kept me on the line until paramedics arrived. Margaret paced behind me, repeatedly insisting Sophie would wake up. When the paramedics rushed through the door, I told them exactly what happened. My mother-in-law slapped me while I was holding her. Margaret interrupted immediately. That is not what happened. Nobody stopped. Sophie was placed onto a stretcher and carried downstairs. I climbed into the ambulance with her, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely unlock my phone. I called Daniel. Once. Twice. 3 times. No answer. At the hospital, Sophie disappeared through emergency room doors while nurses made me stay outside. Minutes stretched unbearably. Then a doctor approached me. "Mrs. Leos." I stood so quickly my chair scraped backward. "Is she alive?" The doctor looked directly at me. "Your daughter is all ready." My stomach dropped. But when he finished that sentence, relief wasn't the only thing I felt. Because his next questions forced me to explain exactly why my 6-week-old daughter had hit that floor. I looked at the swelling on my cheek. Then I remembered Margaret standing over my unconscious baby, telling me to lie about what happened. I pulled out my phone and called the police. Because suddenly, there was a terrifying question I couldn't ignore. Was Sophie's fall really the first time Margaret had put my daughter in danger? The doctor finished the sentence that had nearly stopped my heart. "Your daughter is already breathing independently again, and she's responding to stimulation." My knees weakened. I grabbed the back of the chair beside me. "So she's going to be okay." "The immediate signs are encouraging," he said carefully. "But the scans show a concussion. With a baby this young, we need to monitor her closely for the next several hours." I covered my mouth. For the first time since Sophie hit the floor, I could breathe. Then the doctor's expression changed. "Mrs. Leos, I need you to tell me exactly how your daughter fell." I looked at him. My mother-in-law slapped me. He went still. "You were holding Sophie when she struck you." "Yes." I touched my cheek. It was swollen and tender. I stumbled. Sophie slipped out of my arms. The doctor immediately called a nurse over. They documented the swelling on my face and Sophie's injuries while I repeated what had happened. And as I spoke, memories I had spent weeks dismissing suddenly felt different. Margaret complaining that I held Sophie too much. Margaret telling me, Bobbies need to learn who's in charge. Then there was the afternoon she had snatched Sophie from my arms because she was tired of hearing her cry. Give her to me, you're making her soft. I had taken Sophie back within seconds. But I hadn't told Daniel how frightened Margaret's behavior made me. We needed her house. Daniel kept promising, just a few more months, Vanessa, then we'll have enough saved for our own place. So I kept the peace. Until keeping the peace put my daughter in a hospital bed. Vanessa. I turned. Daniel rushed through the waiting area, still wearing his hospital maintenance uniform. He reached me and grabbed my hands. Where's Sophie? Being monitored. What happened? Before I could answer, another voice cut across the room. She dropped her. Margaret. She was walking toward us. I stared at her. Daniel turned. Mom. She was exhausted, Margaret said. I told her she needed more sleep. She was carrying Sophie around the hallway and she dropped her. My entire body went cold. That's a lie. Margaret looked directly at me. You were barely awake. You slapped me. Daniel's eyes moved to my swollen cheek. Mom, did you hit her? Margaret lowered her voice. Be very careful about what you accuse me of, Vanessa. I stepped toward her. You slapped me while I was holding your granddaughter. She fell because you hit me. Margaret glanced around the waiting room. There were only 2 people in that hallway. That sentence told me exactly what she was doing. No witnesses. 2 different stories. And she intended to make mine the unbelievable one. A police officer approached us. Mrs. Leos. Yes. We need your statement. Margaret started forward. She's confused. No. My voice came out louder than I expected. Everyone stopped. I looked at the officer. I'll give you my statement, but she doesn't come with me. The officer nodded. For the next several minutes, I told him everything. The crying. The argument. The slap. Sophie falling. Margaret telling me to say I had dropped her. When I finished, the officer closed his notebook. We'll need to establish exactly what happened inside that house. He turned to leave. That was when Daniel suddenly went completely still. His face had lost its color. Daniel. He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his car keys from his pocket and hurried after the officer. Wait. The officer turned. Daniel looked back at me once. Then he said something that made Margaret's expression change instantly. There's something at Mom's house they need to see. By the time Daniel returned to Margaret's house with 2 police officers, she had regained her confidence. She unlocked the front door and stepped aside. This is ridiculous, she said. My daughter-in-law dropped her baby because she was exhausted, and now she's trying to blame me. Daniel walked past her without answering. Margaret grabbed his arm. Daniel, stop this. Your wife is destroying this family over an accident. He pulled his arm free. No, Mom. Margaret stared at him. For once, her son wasn't trying to calm everyone down. One officer asked, Mr. Leos, what exactly did you bring us here to see? Daniel looked toward the stairs. Then he said, before I show you, there's something Vanessa doesn't know. Margaret's face tightened. Daniel. He ignored her. 3 weeks ago, I came home early. He told the officers he had heard Sophie crying upstairs. When he entered the nursery, Margaret was holding the baby tightly against her chest. Sophie was screaming. Margaret kept saying, stop, stop crying right now. Daniel had immediately taken Sophie from her. I told my mother never to handle my daughter like that again. Margaret scoffed. You were overreacting. Daniel turned toward her. And I should have told Vanessa. Margaret went silent. Daniel continued. He admitted that he had been afraid Vanessa would insist they move immediately. Their savings weren't enough for the apartment they wanted, and he convinced himself he could control the situation until they moved. Instead, he installed a small motion-activated security camera covering the nursery entrance and the upstairs hallway. My stomach turned when Daniel later told me that part. There had been a warning. My husband had seen it, and he had kept it from me. Back at Margaret's house, Daniel climbed the stairs with the officers behind him. The camera was still there. He removed it carefully and handed it directly to one of them. Margaret rushed forward. You can't take that. The officer looked at her. Why? That camera was installed in my house without my permission. This is my property. Daniel stared at his mother. You weren't worried about the camera until you realized what might be on it. Don't you dare speak to me like that. The second officer stepped between them. Ma'am, we're going to preserve anything potentially relevant to the investigation. You can raise any concerns about the recording through the appropriate process. Margaret's confidence disappeared. At the hospital, I was sitting beside Sophie when Daniel finally called. I answered immediately. Did they find it? There was a pause. Vanessa, I need to tell you something first. He explained the incident from 3 weeks earlier. I couldn't speak. You knew. I thought I handled it. You saw your mother being rough with our 6-week-old daughter, and you didn't tell me. I was scared we'd have nowhere to go. That was my decision too, Daniel. I know. No, you know now. Silence. Then I heard voices behind him. An officer had apparently called him back. Daniel. 1 second. I heard footsteps. Then nothing for several moments. When Daniel came back onto the phone, his voice was barely steady. Vanessa. What? He swallowed. It recorded everything. Everything. My fingers tightened around the phone. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, the hallway, the argument, Mom hitting you, Sophie falling. I looked through the hospital room window at my daughter. For hours, I had been terrified that Margaret's version would become the version everyone believed. Now there was a recording. But Daniel sounded like he had seen something worse. What else is on it? The police want to talk to you. Later, after Sophie's doctor confirmed she was stable enough for me to step away briefly, an officer brought me into a private room. Daniel was already there. A laptop sat open on the table. We can describe the footage instead, the officer told me. I want to see it. He pressed play. There I was, walking slowly through the hallway with Sophie against my chest. Her crying filled the recording. Margaret's bedroom door opened. I watched her follow me. Watched myself turn. Then came the slap. Even knowing it was coming didn't prepare me for seeing it from the outside. My head snapped sideways. My arms jerked apart. Sophie fell. I looked away. Stop. The officer paused the recording. Daniel lowered his head. After several seconds, I whispered, keep going. The video resumed. I was kneeling beside Sophie, calling emergency services. Margaret stood behind me. Then the recording captured words I hadn't fully processed during the panic. Tell them you dropped her because you were tired. I stared at the screen. Margaret moved a blanket and several baby items around the hallway. Then she looked upward, directly toward the camera. She stepped closer and reached for it. The recording ended shortly afterward, but the footage had already been stored. The officer closed the laptop. We now have your statement, the medical documentation, your husband's account of the earlier incident, and this recording. Margaret could no longer turn my daughter's injury into my negligence. The officers returned to the house. Daniel went with them. This time, Margaret wasn't arguing about an exhausted mother. She was being told that the evidence had substantially changed the investigation. When she realized Daniel had provided the recording, she stared at him. "You chose her over your own mother." Daniel answered quietly. "I chose my daughter." Hours later, he returned to the hospital. I met him outside Sophie's room. "We're not going back there," I said. "We won't. Not tonight, not next month, never." Daniel nodded. "I understand." I held his gaze. "And don't think that camera fixes what you did." His face tightened. "I know. You knew there was a problem, Daniel. You decided I didn't need to know. I thought I was protecting us. You were protecting the arrangement." He opened his mouth. "Mrs. Leos." A nurse hurried toward us. My heart jumped. I turned immediately. "The doctor needs you." "What happened?" The nurse's expression softened. "Sophie is awake." I ran back into Sophie's room. She was awake. Her tiny eyes were open, and one hand moved weakly against the blanket. "Sophie." I reached the bed and touched her fingers. They curled around mine. That tiny movement broke through everything I had been holding inside since midnight. The doctor stepped beside me. "She's responding normally to your voice and touch. Her neurological signs are reassuring. So she's going to be okay. She suffered a concussion from the fall, so we're keeping her under observation. But right now, we're encouraged by what we're seeing." I bent over and kissed Sophie's forehead. Only then did I fully understand the sentence that had terrified me earlier. When the doctor had approached me and said, "Your daughter is all ready," he had meant Sophie was already breathing independently again and responding to stimulation. Not that she was gone. And once he asked how a 6-week-old baby had ended up unconscious on the floor, I had finally said the entire truth aloud. My mother-in-law slapped me while I was holding her. That truth had started everything that followed. The police now had more than my word. The hallway camera showed Margaret following me toward the nursery, arguing with me and striking me while Sophie was visibly in my arms. It showed Sophie falling immediately afterward. And it captured what Margaret did next. "Tell them you dropped her because you were tired." Then she moved items around the hallway before noticing the camera and reaching toward it. The exhausted mother's story Margaret tried to build around me was finished. But there was another truth I still had to deal with. Daniel. When Sophie was settled again, I asked him to come into the hallway. "You saw your mother handling Sophie roughly 3 weeks ago." He nodded. "And you didn't tell me." "I thought if I confronted Mom and installed the camera, I could keep it from happening again." "You don't get to decide which dangers involving my daughter I'm allowed to know about." "I know." "No, Daniel, listen to me." He did. "If you had told me, I might have taken Sophie out of that house that day." His eyes dropped. "I was scared we'd lose the place to live." "I was scared too. I was recovering from childbirth. We didn't have much money, but those were problems we should have faced together." Daniel didn't defend himself. "I protected the peace with my mother when I should have protected you and Sophie," he said. "I'm sorry." I believed he regretted it. That didn't mean everything was suddenly repaired. Trust isn't coming back because you apologized. "I understand. You rebuild it." He nodded. And for the first time, he didn't ask me to forgive his mother. The police investigation moved forward using my statement, the hospital documentation, Daniel's account of the earlier incident, and the recording. Margaret was arrested and faced charges connected to the assault and Sophie's resulting injury. While the case proceeded, she was prohibited from contacting Sophie and me. Some relatives had already heard Margaret's version, that an exhausted new mother had dropped her baby and blamed someone else. Then they learned there was video. The calls stopped. The excuses stopped. Most importantly, Margaret lost the one thing she had always used against me: control. This is my house. You should be grateful. If you don't like it, leave. So we did. After Sophie was cleared to leave the hospital with follow-up care, Daniel and I collected our belongings under controlled circumstances. I didn't argue with Margaret. I didn't need to. We moved into a smaller apartment than the one we'd been saving for. The rent stretched our budget. We delayed plans and cut expenses. But when I closed our own front door that first night, nobody on the other side could threaten my daughter because she cried. I gave Daniel one absolute boundary. Your mother has no access to Sophie unless the legal situation allows it, and I believe it's safe. I won't fight you on that. Don't negotiate for her either. I won't. And he kept that promise. Trust between us didn't repair overnight. Daniel had to prove through his actions that he understood what his silence had cost. Weeks passed. Sophie recovered well and continued reaching the developmental milestones her doctors wanted to see. One night, sometime after midnight, she started crying. For a moment, I was back in Margaret's hallway. Then I looked around. My apartment. My daughter. My rules. I lifted Sophie from her crib and held her against my chest. Cry if you need to, I whispered. Mommy's here. Her little hand closed around my finger. Margaret had told me to silence my newborn daughter or get out of her house. So I got out and made sure neither that house nor Margaret's power over our family could ever put my daughter in danger again.